Hello, everyone, and welcome to 10-Minute Election. We are talking about the Georgia Senate runoff elections. Jon Ossoff versus David Perdue in the regular election. Raphael Warnock versus Kelly Loeffler in the special election. These two races will decide control of the Senate, given that Republicans have currently won 50 seats and Democrats 48. So these two seats, if Democrats win both, Kamala Harris would be the Senate tie-breaking vote, meaning Democrats would have a Senate majority and a government trifecta with both houses of the legislature as well as the presidency in their hands. Otherwise, Mitch McConnell would stay on as Senate Majority Leader, which would make it much more difficult for Biden to pass a lot of the legislation he campaigned on. So, again, those are the stakes. The Democrats have already narrowly won the House and the presidency. So, I want to jump right into the 2016 Georgia presidential election because this is really interesting. Donald Trump won by 5 points here. He actually did win the majority of the presidential vote in 2016. And so the reason that Biden won Georgia in 2020, and the reason, frankly, that Clinton lost, are twofold. I want to talk about the stories of two blue counties that, in fact, neighbor each other. So in Cobb County, which is the suburb just outside of Atlanta, Hillary Clinton only won by 2 points. She didn't do very well with suburban voters. She didn't do very well with a lot of the white voters, which comprised the majority of the electorate there. And in Fulton County, which is really metro Atlanta, she won handily. She won by 41 points, but she did a terrible job of driving up turnout. She didn't even hit 300,000 votes, despite obviously winning a huge majority of it. So even though Clinton won 41% of this vote compared to Biden beating Trump by a 46-point margin in Fulton County in 2020, the actual vote totals, the bulk vote totals, tell a very different story here. And in 2018, we see Stacey Abrams. She is driving up turnout. Stacey Abrams actually won more votes in Fulton County than Hillary Clinton, despite the 2018 being not even an election year. And she actually won Cobb County by 10 points compared to Clinton's 2. So those getting out the vote efforts, especially among suburbs which swing liberal but also don't vote as much, or at least they did in this case, Stacey Abrams did do a much better job of getting those out. She cut into some Republican margins across the state, and she did all right down in Savannah and the other blue counties in the southwestern part of the state, but it wasn't quite enough to beat Brian Kemp in a highly suspect election, given that Brian Kemp was the Secretary of State at the time of this election, refused to resign, but nonetheless, he did win 50.2% of the vote compared to Abrams' 48.8%. So now let's take a look at the two Georgia Senate maps, or I'm sorry, the two Georgia electoral maps. I'm sorry, I meant to put the 2020 Senate election results down here. I think I put them on another slide. But David Perdue won approximately 49.7% of the vote in the regular Senate election, that is, compared to Jon Ossoff's 47.9% and Libertarian candidate Shane Hazel's 2.3%. So Biden won Cobb County by an astounding 14 points. It was the best Democratic performance here in a long time. And although it's really not the route Bill Clinton used to win the state in 1992. He won it by really winning a large coalition of liberal and conservative voters across the state. Joe Biden really pushed up turnout. He won nearly 400,000 votes in Fulton County, where Hillary Clinton couldn't even manage 300,000. Again, he won Cobb County by 14 points, and Democrats are going to need and look toward building on that in the runoff elections. And he did cut into Republican margins by 2-3 points across the rest of the state. Did just fine in Savannah and the other blue counties, not as populous, obviously. The Senate map, we do see some discrepancies. Ossoff did not do as well as Biden, and we actually saw a good deal of split ticket voting here, seeing as Biden won the state on the presidential level, but David Perdue actually ran a half a point ahead of Donald Trump. And so you saw a lot of voters in Georgia saying disapproving of Trump, but still maybe those more conservative. Generally, I know I said Cobb County suburban voters could swing liberal, but oftentimes suburban voters across the state are going to swing conservative, and we saw that even splitting their tickets. Biden, Perdue, and possibly even Loeffler, although some of those voters actually took the Biden, Perdue, Warnock route. That now the Perdue, Warnock, and Loeffler Ossoff voting is probably not going to be as prevalent in the runoff as it was in the Senate elections. But it's interesting to see how, of course, David Perdue is running ahead of Kelly Loeffler. Kelly Loeffler is running ahead of Donald Trump. And that's really due to Fulton County. Actually, John Ossoff did just fine in. But again, Cobb County just wasn't quite able to drive up those margins, and in the rest of the state as well. And I was saying, I know these maps these maps are a little distorted from each other in terms of colors, but where Biden was chipping in to those Trump margins in red counties by 2 to 3 points, Ossoff really wasn't, and so that's what caused David Perdue to beat him, although not by the 50% required to avoid a runoff. So let's look at election day results now, numerical election day results, and let's talk about the last Georgia Senate runoff, which happened in 2008 when neither Senate candidate, Saxby Chambliss or Jim Martin, received 50% of the vote. So presidential, obviously, Joe Biden, the Democrat, won 49.5% compared to Republican Donald Trump's 49.26. In the regular Senate election, regular Senate is David Perdue versus John Ossoff, and special election is Kelly Loeffler versus Raphael Warnock. So Senate regular election, David Perdue won 49.7% of the vote. John Ossoff won 47.9% of the vote. And Libertarian candidate Shane Hazel, and I want to talk about Shane Hazel, won the remaining 2.3% of the vote, because Shane Hazel ran in a Republican primary for a House seat in 2018. He lost, although he received a decent portion of the vote there. He has declined to endorse either candidate. He has hinted potential support at Ossoff over Perdue, but a lot of his voters are probably going to lean more Perdue, although he has really markedly criticized both candidates. So there's really no indication as to how these voters will go. If I had to put money on, I would probably say that we would see something like a 1.3 to 1.0 split Perdue to Ossoff for these voters. But again, we don't even know. In fact, most of these voters probably aren't even going to turn out, especially if they didn't vote on the presidential level, or for that matter, let me hit on this. They voted for Donald Trump. Here's why. Donald Trump has obviously perpetuated a lot of pretty baseless claims of voter fraud, and that has, in a lot of Republican voters' minds, polls have shown that a majority of Republican voters do support Trump's efforts, that they have looked negatively upon Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue's response to that. A lot of voters feel that they have done too little to back up Trump and stand with Trump. Now, neither of them have said that Biden is the president-elect. Both of them called on the Secretary of State to resign, but a lot of Republican interest groups have actually been saying don't vote for Loeffler and Perdue because they are not doing enough to perpetuate Trump's claims in Georgia and flip the results, which aren't going to flip. Joe Biden won more votes than Donald Trump in the state of Georgia. In fact, there was a billboard in Georgia. Kelly and David didn't stand with Trump, don't stand with them. And there's stuff like this happening all across the state. You've got multiple Trump lawyers even saying, just sit out this election, boycott this election. And according to polls, in some of the counties outside of the Fulton metro area, like some of the neighboring counties to Cobb County, polls have shown that this is actually having an effect, that Republican turnout is going to be down in these elections because a lot of people have been saying, I voted for Trump, but clearly this election was rigged. So why should we even bother in this election? It's troublesome logic, but apparently it's actually having an impact, and statistics backs that up. Now, I know I said that in multiple previous videos that I would be going off polls a lot less to project election winners. And that's true. I'm looking more at maps and demographic shifts, especially with Georgia. However, I want to say polls actually got Georgia fairly right. I think the RCP Georgia average was D plus 1.2. The result was D plus 0.3 on the presidential level. So they were off by only a tilt margin. That's pretty good, especially compared to where the RCP averages were for a whole lot of other states. Arizona, certainly Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Florida, they were off by multiple points, 3, 4, 5, 6 points in a lot of these states, which is pushing up against the margin of error. In fact, polls were this election, they were they were about as wrong, if not even more wrong in certain areas than they were in 2016. They just weren't wrong enough for Donald Trump to win. So in 2008, as I was saying, I went off a massive tangent there. Turnout went down 43% from election day to runoff, and in general, Democrats have a tougher time replicating election day turnout than Republicans do. This time, that might not be the case because of the boycott efforts on the Republican side, huge enthusiasm on the Democratic side, huge stakes, obviously, huge fundraising, huge advertising, and whatnot. Um, so ultimately, we may see that general massive turnout decline. You can see 43% from election day to the runoff in 2008. We might even say that neutralized. Huge voter registration efforts still happening in the state. The voter registration deadline passed in early December, but Stacey Abrams' group, Verified Georgia, still working to really get out the vote, and Democrats think they can. The Democratic Party's actually expressed great confidence that they can get out the vote at Cobb County as almost as high, if not actually election day levels in this runoff election. So in 2008, Saxby Chambliss, who was going up against Jim Martin in that election, neither of them won a majority of the vote on 2008 election day, but Chambliss gained nearly 8% in the runoff. He won over 57% of the vote in the runoff compared to Martin's 43. In fact, in every runoff election that Georgia has had, there has been a Republican gain from election day to the runoff. And this is just due to that Republicans are generally better at more consistently getting out the vote than Democrats are. We saw it in 2010 and 2018. 2010, Obama was actually still had a net positive approval rating. More people approved of then President Obama than disapproved of him. And yet Republicans won a huge majority in the House and basically redistricting privileges in pretty much all the state legislatures that they needed to. Or could have, for that matter, and these are effects that are still lasting to this day, and helped them nearly win back the House this election. So in that case, Republicans again won a massive House majority. Now in 2018, Donald Trump was not a popular president. He had a net negative approval rating by multiple points. His approval rating was something like 42% at the time of those midterm elections. Democrats won back the House, but not as resoundingly as Republicans did in 2010, despite a much more unpopular president, because Democrats, just as a general rule, don't get out the vote as much, especially when there's a Democratic incumbent. But even when there was a Republican incumbent, like in 2010, turnout was low overall. It was a very low turnout midterm election, but Democratic turnout was super low. And the only reason that turnout figure was even there is because Republicans turned out against Obama, sweeping a whole lot of House seats that had been Democratic for generations in the Deep South and states such as Alabama, Mississippi, and the rural parts of those areas. So I know I said I would go off polls less, but I do want to look at some because there have been some. Don't take these Trafalgar groups polls at face value. They've done some interesting polls and some interesting different styles of polls, but ultimately, as you can see by the C minus rating given by 538, these really aren't fantastic polls, and they generally do call elections incorrectly. They got Florida right in 2018 when Andrew Gillum was favored to win by nearly every media outlet, and yet very narrowly lost that gubernatorial election to Rick Scott. Same with, to Ron DeSantis. Bill Nelson was the incumbent Democratic senator that actually lost in a blue wave year in 2018 to then incumbent Republican governor Rick Scott. So they called that election correctly, but have also gotten a lot wrong. So we can see these are from most recent to least recent, although even the least recent ones are still December 3rd. So we have Trafalgar groups showing Loeffler +3 and Ossoff and Perdue even. I don't necessarily trust these, even considering that Warnock actually ran nearly a whole point ahead of Ossoff. And there have actually been multiple sets of polls, since these polls are generally conducted in pairs, that shows Ossoff running even 5 points ahead of Raphael Warnock. I don't buy that at all. This There's no rating given for this polling form, but it shows Warnock +1, Ossoff +2, and maybe these polls that show John Ossoff running ahead of Raphael Warnock do pay some tribute to the fact that, frankly, John Ossoff has been running an excellent campaign on the ground in the last few weeks. Although I think that, frankly, these polls that are showing Ossoff running ahead of Warnock are exaggerating his support, given Kelly Loeffler's extreme unpopularity. David Perdue is not a popular senator either, but not as nearly as hated as Kelly Loeffler. And Kelly Loeffler is even hated by a good portion of Georgia's conservatives and Republicans. Kelly Loeffler is one of the most unpopular senators in the country, and she hasn't even been there a year. This one has Warnock +3, Perdue +2. Again, I I don't understand these polls that have the two candidates apart by something like 5 points. I would be surprised if they ran even 1 point apart. I certainly don't think they will run more than 1 point apart. So Warnock +3, Perdue +2. That's in line with what I'm saying, where Warnock might run slightly ahead of Ossoff, but not by this much either. This Trafalgar Group poll has Loeffler +5, Ossoff +1, and then a separate poll on December 4th, same day, has Warnock +2, Ossoff +1. Honestly, this is about the median poll. This is backed up by a lot of other polls. Frankly, I find the Warnock +2 and Ossoff +1 easiest to believe. But note how none of these polls show any candidate with a majority, so you really can't take anything from them. See, you would say, oh, look, Warnock and Ossoff are leading. They have 48% of the vote to Loeffler's 46 and Purdue's 47. Remember, there are two candidates. They're going to add up to 100. So the undecided voters could genuinely swing every which way because we don't even know who they are. If they're liberals or conservatives, if they're suburban or urban or rural, what these undecided voters are. So we really can't take anything from a poll unless it's showing a candidate with 50+% of the vote. Even this one, 50% to 47%. There may be another Republican 3% out there, and it's well within this poll's margin of error that Kelly Loeffler still wins this race. December 3rd, this is the only A-rated poll here, so I want to pay a little more heed to it. But again, and this one also has Warnock at 52%, Ossoff at 50%. Warnock +7, Ossoff +2. It's a much more reputable pollster. The results aren't going to go this way, but again, much more reputable pollster. And overall, Warnock should run ahead of Ossoff, so there might be some truth to that. Lastly, exactly how much this Senate election means. And I want to go beyond 2020 here because this is obviously the 2020 Senate map. These are the results aside from Georgia, the two Georgia races decide control of the Senate. This on the right side of your screen is the 2022 Senate map. So everything that's filled in is my projections. You'll notice that the Georgia special election, because the Georgia special election, Warnock versus Loeffler, that seat goes up again in 2022. The only reason there's a special election there is to fill Johnny Isaacson's seat, who retired at the end of 2019, was last elected in 2016. Kelly Loeffler was appointed to fill a seat at the beginning of 2020, and now is a special election to serve out the last 2 years of his term. That seat will probably go Republican, just knowing how Georgia, even though it went for Biden, is still ultimately a conservative state right now at the end of the day. Now, granted, there could be more demographic shifts. Certainly on par with what we've seen, Democrats have made gains every election in Georgia since 2016. That said, it should be somewhat of a red wave year, especially if 2010 is any indication. But the regular election between John Ossoff and David Perdue, that's for a full 6-year term. David Perdue was first elected in 2014. This is his 2020 re-election campaign. This seat, the winner of Ossoff versus Perdue, will serve in the Senate until they go up in 2026, and a new senator is inaugurated in 27. So this is a full Senate term up in this seat. So you can see on this map, Republicans have 49 seats, Democrats have 47. My way too early projections are that Arizona and Pennsylvania go blue by less than a point, and Wisconsin goes red by less than a point. That would give the Republican Party 50 seats, including Georgia special, the Democratic Party 49 seats, and Georgia would decide literally not only the 2020 Senate, but the 2022 Senate. So this Ossoff versus Perdue race may well decide not 2, but 4 years of Senate control. Okay, I know it's been a long one, but there's a whole lot to talk about with this election. Thank y'all so much for watching 10-minute elections. Please like, subscribe, and comment. Follow my Instagram. It's 10-minute elections, all lowercase, all one word. We are getting closer and closer to the big 50 subscribers, so I would really appreciate any support. Tell your friends. Tell me what you think down in the comments, and I will be back soon with a video on it could be some different things, but probably the state legislature and gubernatorial elections.